What's going on, guys? Ben from JK Gear and Gadgets. Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to another video. In this episode, we are talking about adjustable control arms, all the differences, what they do you need them, and then finally we are adding a set to the Gladiator. So over here we have a little display set up so we can do some visual representation of what I'm talking about. The reason I'm making this video is because I was originally just gonna add some control arms to the Gladiator, beef it up a little bit, make a video on it, but I got a few requests to kind of go back to the basics. Most of you guys know that we did the DIY 3-link on the JK, and that was great. A lot of people liked that info, but there were a lot of people that didn't really understand what I was talking about. I was talking about caster, pinion angle, all the different styles of joints, all that kind of stuff. So we're gonna take it a step back in this video, go into a little more detail, kind of beginner friendly, and even if you already know how to do this, hopefully you'll learn something in this video. Let's get started. We're first going to start off with talking about control arms, kind of from the factory, what they look like, what they do. And luckily we have 3 different Jeeps here. We have the Gladiator, very similar to the JL. We have a TJ, LJ, same suspension design. And we have a JK. The JK already has an upgraded long arm kit 3-link, so we're not going to be talking about that too much. But let's focus on the Gladiator. So control arms, if you hop up under your Jeep, you will notice that there are 2 lower bars, one on that side, one on this side, that run from the axle towards the frame. And then there's also one up there, which is your upper. So you have a total of 4 control arms running to the axle to hold it in place, forward and back. Now the component that holds it side to side is your track bar, and that is attached to your axle down here and the frame on the other side. So that holds it shifting side to side. This is called a 4-link suspension with a track bar or panhard bar. Some people call it a 5-link, but it's pretty much just a 4-link. And most modern Jeeps share this exact same suspension design. Even the LJ shares it as well. Let's take a look under there. As you can tell, we have our lower, we have our upper attached to the top of the axle there going to the frame, and the exact same thing is mimicked on the passenger side. This type of design is very kind of friendly. It's a good suspension design, it rides nice, it handles great, and honestly it's plenty strong from the factory. But once we start adding bigger tires, a lift kit, and all kinds of other things, there's a few issues we need to address, and that's where adjustable control arms come into play. For this project, I decided to go with a set of core 4x4 adjustable control arms. We're going to talk about all the specs and everything in a little bit, but first I want to show you what makes an adjustable control arm different than a standard one. So here is a factory JK control arm. As you can tell, we just have rubber bushings on both sides with a little metal sleeve on the inside, and there's not much to it. It's from the factory, it's the correct length. What we have here is a set of adjustable control arms. We have nice little Johnny joint ends, which we'll talk about in a minute, a little jam nut here, and internal, as you can tell, is threaded. So what this allows us to do is make this control arm longer or shorter based on our Jeep's need. So when do we need to start worrying about adding adjustable control arms to our Jeep? I'm gonna make this short and sweet. There's a lot of different opinions on the subject, but my opinion is anytime we lift the Jeep, I would definitely recommend a set of adjustable control arms. You don't have to get all 8, depending on your lift height, and we'll talk about that later. If you're running a small lift and you're, kind of on the lower end of the budget, I'd recommend just the front lowers to dial in a few of your alignment specs. We'll talk about that later. But another big thing, even if you're not lifted, new control arms are a lot stronger than the factory ones from the factory. They are cheesy. So here in the LJ, the LJs and TJs actually came with some of the weakest control arms. So here they are, as you can tell, but if you look underneath, they're hollow. It's just thin stamped sheet metal. If we hit this with a rock, it would bend. But on the Gladiator and the JKs and JLs, Jeep actually made them a little stronger than previous models. As you can tell, they're still pretty thin, but they aren't hollow underneath. It is like a boxed control arm, but still, once you're running bigger tires and going off-road, that's still gonna bend pretty easily. So here we have a set of adjustable control arms. There's a lot of different manufacturers. You guys have probably seen that. Every manufacturer claims that they're the best. They have the best ends. They get you the best flex. They're the strongest. No maintenance or maintenance, but they flex more. I know it's hard to comprehend, and there's a lot. I'm really not partial to any company when it comes to like adjustable control arms, because in my mind, all of them are better than stock. So let's talk about the rod ends real quick. Let's get started with that. because that's a huge portion of what control arms you should use. The first thing we're gonna take a look at is the factory style. Nothing but a rubber bushing inside. It does do a great job on the road. Rubber is gonna dampen a lot of vibrations from transferring from the road up into the cab. The issue with this is that rubber does not have much give when you're off-roading and really flexing and articulating your suspension. Now there's multiple different types of replacements. There's polyurethane bushings, we have Heim joints, we have Johnny joints, we have all kinds of things. And now there's a bunch of companies making like hybrid rubber bushings. You know, with different durometers, meaning the rubber's softer or the rubber's hard in the middle, and out here on the outside it kind of tapers down and gets softer so it flexes more. There's so many different styles, but what we're going to look at real quick is how much flexibility actually matters. So we'll start off with the Heim joint. These are mostly for rock crawlers or more heavy-duty off-road use rigs because, as you can tell, it's a solid piece of metal in there. There's not going to be much vibration resistance. They can be a little loud, but they do offer the most flex. And what I mean by that is how much movement is in the joint before it bottoms out on the bracket. So as you can tell, if we flip this sideways, we have a lot of movement in between that bracket. Really, really good. Now, Heim joints are going to offer some of the most flex compared to any other joint style. Next up would be the Johnny joint style. This is an old control arm and these are actually Johnny joints. So what Johnny joints are is kind of a mix between a normal bushing and a Heim joint. They're rebuildable, very easy to set up, and all it is a ball similar to this. See that inside ball piece right there? And it's that inside a kind of built together bushing. There's a rubber or like a hard plastic sleeve that goes in there, then this metal washer, and then a snap ring to kind of hold it all in place. This will let us have a good amount of misalignment and still offer that vibration resistance that we want with rubber bushings. Now the issue with these is that we don't have too much room for misalignment within the bracket. The Heim joint, since it's thinner, we can use pretty much all of that misalignment from side to side. With this, we're only gonna get a little bit before it kind of bottoms out on the bracket. So you can see we have side-to-side movement, but it hits the edge of the brackets before we get all of the misalignment out of this actual joint. That's one thing I will mention real quick. When you're looking at all these suspension and control arm manufacturers bragging about how much their joint will misalign, meaning, oh, we have 30 degrees misalignment in our joint. That is awesome, but do you have 30 degrees of misalignment inside of a bracket? The bracket's what matters, so honestly, if you're looking for the most misalignment, a Heim joint is what you're gonna want. Now that we've talked about these two, let's take a look at a rubber bushing. As you can tell in here, we have just the standard end, just like this stock rubber bushing. It is sandwiched up in this bracket. There is no side-to-side movement in there. There's no room for it to. The rubber will actually flex a little bit and give, but that leads to cracking. So let me pull this out and show you what I'm talking about. So right here, you can see where the rubber over time has bent and kind of, you know, been forced to move around, and it leads to cracking in the rubber. What that's gonna do is make it really loose. We can get some vibrations up through the Jeep. It can contribute to a wobble in your front end. May not cause death wobble, but it's definitely something you don't want. Man, this part is gonna be very long. Sorry guys, but now that we kind of covered the basics of some different styles, control arms, let's talk about what they actually do to your axle. But here we have an old axle. This is an old Dana 30, but it doesn't really matter what the axle is. I wanna show you guys the mounting points of where control arms are actually gonna go. We have our lower control arm mount goes right here. Our upper control arm mount, upper and lower. What do your control arms do? Like I already mentioned, they hold this axle to the frame, hold it forward and back. What it also does is control your pinion angle and your caster angle. Your pinion angle is where it's pretty much the angle of what your pinion is pointing up to. We want to have a nice pinion angle going to the output of our transfer case, the whole four-wheel drive part of our Jeep. Once we lift our Jeep, this output of the transfer case is going to go up however many inches we just lifted our Jeep. As you can tell, this angle is not very good. So what we would do is get a better pinion angle by making our control arms longer, adjustable, and pushing this up more in line. Now what that will do is affect our caster angle. Caster angle is what returns your tires back to center. So when you're going around a turn, if you let off the steering wheel, it's going to want to go back to center. It's not going to keep driving around in circles and circles. What that does is make your Jeep drive a lot better on the road. It makes the steering feel tighter and overall just handles better. And that angle is found by looking at your axle knuckles. We're gonna draw an imaginary line through the upper and lower, and whatever that angle is our caster angle. So we'll go ahead and turn this little digital angle finder on, and as you can tell, it's 1.4 right now. So that is like no caster. This Jeep, if this was under a Jeep, it would drive horrible. What we would do to fix this is either shorten our uppers or extend our lowers to bring this back a little bit. So as you can tell now, it's leaning back very far. We have almost 10 degrees of caster, which would drive amazing on the street. But now our pinion angle is almost negative. If we had our transfer case way up here, it would be very, very bad. All right, so if you're still around, sorry for that very long presentation in the beginning. I still have more to talk about. I guess I'll go ahead and get it out of the way. Kind of tricked you, didn't I? After you lift your Jeep, a few things happen. When you lift the Jeep higher with the factory control arms, we're gonna lose a little bit of that caster. So if we started out like at a -6 degrees caster, lifted it a few inches, we're now gonna drop back down to like -4, a lower number. And that happens because as the body goes up, the control arms are kind of pulling the axle and rotating it forward, getting some of that caster out of the suspension, which really sucks. The only way to bring that back in is by adjustable control arms, extending them back. What also happens is when we lift this, it's a very minute amount, but what happens is our tire and axle actually get shifted back a little bit. Imagine it. We lift this up really high. Since these swing in an arc, it's gonna wanna drop back. It's not that drastic, but the great thing is with adjustable control arms, we can push that axle back forward. As you can tell, adjustable control arms are extremely necessary, and that's why most reputable lift kit companies, suspension companies, include them in their lift kits. But if you ordered a lift kit that doesn't have them, luckily it's an easy upgrade to add later on, or you can either add it before the fact of a lift kit, or whenever you want. Let's get started. The first thing we're gonna do is chalk the front wheels in front and behind the tire. We're also gonna grab our jack and support the pinion on the axle. We're then gonna go ahead and remove both lower control arm bolts. With the control arm removed, we're left with this annoying little brake line anchor. Since our new control arms don't have the bolt for this, we're gonna have to remove this. We have a few options. You can cut it, put vice grips on it, try to turn it, or just cut it as close to this crimp as possible and call it good. So our next step is to go to our workbench and measure out our control arm length, set it, and then reinstall it under the Jeep. Now, since my Jeep doesn't really have that much of a lift, I only added the 1.5 inch spacers. We don't need to go too far out of spec of the stock length. Most lift kits are gonna tell you a recommended length. The higher you go up, the longer you wanna make these control arms. But like I said, since it's only 1.5 inches higher and it probably sagged a little bit due to the winch and bumper, we're not gonna set it too much longer. So at this point, it's really hard to explain on video how long you need to make these. You can make them a little longer than the factory ones. What that will do is push your axle forward. Now, if you do that, you have to replicate the same thing on the upper. So you're gonna have to play around with it, see how far you wanna push forward your axle, and then use your uppers to control your caster and pinion angle. First thing we're gonna do is measure from eye to eye on our stock arm that we just took off, right in the middle of the bushing to the middle of the bushing, and get that measurement so we can replicate it on our new one, or add a little bit to her. 24 inches. Now, what I found interesting on the new JL and Gladiator factory control arms, see how the bushing is ribbed right there? That's actually really interesting. So this clamps down really good inside the bracket and it's not gonna shift around. I wish more manufacturers started adding that to their control arms. It's a pretty cool feature. First thing we're gonna do is loosen this jam nut. What the jam nut does is hold this in place. So yes, our joint is threaded up inside the rod, but we don't want to rely on those threads to hold this in. The jam nut is what we're going to tighten out the very end to set it at the final spec. What this does is really put pressure on all those threads, so this almost acts as a solid unit. So all we're going to do is grab our tape measure and measure from eye to eye once again and get 24 inches plus about 1/4. So we'll do 24 1/4. Here in a few minutes, I'll talk about why I chose the Core 4x4 control arms and all of the different options they have on their website. It's actually pretty cool. Normally, you'd make sure that you unthread this all the way and apply anti-seize to all these threads, so later on it's easy to make adjustments. But it looks like Core already installed a little bit of copper anti-seize all the way on there when they installed it. See that right there? So that's really neat. We're not gonna have to mess around and get all dirty with anti-seize. So now that this is semi-locked down, we can bring this over to the Jeep and get it installed. We're gonna start off by installing our new control arm on the frame side. We're gonna put it in the bracket and get the bolt through. With one side in, we would now normally slide this up and put that bolt through. But since we made this control arm a little bit longer, this bolt might not line up. What we have to do now, since this is a little bit longer, is bring the axle forward a little bit or rotate our pinion down so that bracket swings forward so we can get our bolt through. I went ahead and took a little pressure off the jack. We should be able to squeeze this bolt in there. If you're moving it quite a ways, what you'd have to do is unchalk the wheels and kind of rotate the tire forward to move the axle. So our control arm is in here. We are good to go. What we're gonna do is start both nuts. We are not gonna torque it down yet until we finish up all of the other arms. With this side installed, we're gonna do the exact same steps over on the other side lower. We now have both lowers installed. It is time to turn and look at the uppers, but we're gonna stop right here for a second and talk about a few things. If you only have the budget for either a single set, whether it's lowers or uppers in the front, I suggest starting off with the lowers for two reasons. They're more prone to being bent and damaged off-road, so you get a little more strength that way. And secondly, you can still adjust your caster and pinion angle with only the lower. If you want more caster, you would make the lowers longer. What that would do is push the axle so we have more negative caster. If we need to increase our pinion angle, you just make the lowers a little bit shorter. So lowers are definitely the best way to go if you only have to upgrade one. If you want to move your front axle forward though, is when you're definitely going to need a set of lowers and uppers. Now this brings me into the point of why I chose the Core 4x4 control arms. They're actually fairly affordable. They did give us a discount code for this video using the code JKGEAR, 5% off any of their control arms, any Jeep, whether it's the Gladiator or JL. And let me talk about that real quick. They have not came out with the rear set for the Gladiator yet. They're working on it. The fronts on the JLs and the JTs are exactly the same. Core also has a set for every other Jeep pretty much known to man. XJ, TJ, LJ, YJ doesn't use control arms, ignore that. JK, WJ, ZJs, a bunch of different Jeeps. They have all the adjustable control arms. And they actually have a few different styles. They have a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4. And what those different tiers are the different options in the joint ends on what you want to get. Next up is to install our upper control arms. This is where our caster and pinion angle is going to come into play. Right now, it's still very close to stock. It's probably around -6 degrees caster with a 0 degree pinion angle. Jeeps and other axles have a certain amount of degrees built into the axle. What that means is the degrees of separation. I'll just have to show you. It's kind of hard to explain. The degrees of separation is the distance between our caster angle and our pinion angle. On Jeeps, most Jeeps, newer Jeeps, are gonna have around 6 degrees of separation, meaning if we have a -6 degree caster angle, our pinion angle is gonna be at 0. If we have -4 degrees caster, we're gonna have a 2 degree pinion angle. So as this goes up, our pinion angle goes up. 6 degrees of separation. Right now, if my pinion angle is flat, it's very neutral, 0 degrees, means I have -6 degrees of caster, which is gonna ride great on the road, it's gonna handle well, but our pinion angle might not be great. Luckily, since I'm running a low lift, and since the JLs and JTs have the center axle disconnect or the front axle disconnect, it means our drive shaft is not spinning going down the road, which means we can get away with running a little more caster. In the end, what I'll probably end up doing is run about -5 degrees caster, which leaves our pinion angle at 1 degree positive, pointing up slightly. Once we lift the Jeep higher, I might have to sacrifice a little, bump our pinion angle up to 2 degrees, so it points up higher at our new lifted Jeep. In return, we'll only be running -4 degrees caster. So there's a lot of messing with it, a lot of playing around to figure out what rides best and what you want to sacrifice. And that leads into our next step of installing our upper control arms. We're first gonna go ahead and remove this factory heat shield. I think it's a 10mm, and of course I can't find mine. There is a little wire attached here to the upper control arm. It's one of those little Christmas tree plastic plugs. We are not going to reinstall that on our new control arm. Factory upper control arm was 20 1/8. What we're gonna do with this new one is put it around 20 1/4. So it's not much of a difference, but since we're adding upper and lower, the lower's extended further than factory. What that did is push the axle forward a little bit and give us a little more caster. What I want to do is kind of put it back all to factory spec. So what we're going to do is make the upper a little bit longer and bring that caster back to around 5 where it was from the factory. So this step you're really going to have to play around, and the best thing to do is get all this installed, take it to an alignment shop, request a printout of your alignment readings, and see where you're at. If you're at 5 degrees caster on one side, 4 on the other, that tells you you need to make adjustments to this side. There's also something called your thrust angle, and what that does is measure how square your axle is. If the lower control arm over on your driver's side is longer than this side, the axle is going to be canted this way. So whenever you get that alignment printout, if you have any questions, ask your alignment guy. They should know. Or come over to JK Gear and Gadgets, the group on Facebook, post up your alignment spec sheet, and we'll be more than happy to go in depth and explain what you may need to do on your Jeep. Once again, we're still gonna leave everything loose and come over to the driver's side and do the exact same steps. All we have left to do is verify that our pinion angle and caster angles are correct. Since I didn't deviate too much away from the factory specs, we should be good to go. I can tell that my pinion angle is exactly where I want it to be. Now our next steps to call this job complete is to go through and torque all the bolts and nuts on each sides of the control arms. Once that's done, we're gonna come over here and torque all of our jam nuts. We're gonna need a really big crescent wrench to grab this, or some crow's feet wrenches. Those really help out. We're gonna reinstall any Zerk fittings and grease up these joints if they need greased. After that, we're gonna hit the road and see how they ride. Just like that, we now have adjustable control arms installed on the front of our Jeep. Super simple, we can do it in the driveway, and there's really not that much to it. If you follow the steps just like I did, you'll have no issue getting these under the Jeep. What this does is just this whole install, it lines us up for a better build in the future, especially right now with how my Jeep is. If I want to add a lift kit or bigger springs, taller springs, all I have to do is adjust my control arms to get everything back in spec. We also have a lot stronger control arms, which is a big thing for me. I didn't want to go off-road and damage the lower control arms and have to drive all the way like 4 hours home with the Jeep riding like crap. It'd be super unsafe, and honestly with these control arms, I definitely don't see them bending anytime soon. Another big thing is that now with these joints, the Johnny joints, they have a lot more misalignment, so we can off-road our Jeep. It's not going to give us better flex because most of your flex and down travel is controlled by your shocks. But what these arms are going to do is let it flex and kind of articulate more without binding. Those old joints would bind, and yes, they would continue to flex, but that's not good on the joints and the brackets as well. That's an easy way to rip the brackets off if your joint is maxed out and it still has more to go. You don't want to rip the brackets off the frame or the axle. So what we have now is a good setup. It's kind of a starting platform to continue the build, and it's definitely a good setup for off-road and on-road use as well. Now, a few things I didn't mention about the core 4x4 arms. They are available for custom powder coating. As you can tell, I got mine red because I'm trying to go with the silver and red theme on the Jeep. I think it's gonna look really good. They have all different types of colors: red, yellow, green, blue. It is a little extra fee, but honestly, I think it's pretty cool to get custom powder coated arms for the Jeep. You know, sure, it might be a little crazy. Like on my JK, I probably wouldn't because that's more of like an off-road machine and I know it'd get scratched up anyways. But for builds like this, I think it's gonna really tie into the overall theme. That is enough talking. I guess since we're not going wheeling today, Cassie's in DC, we're gonna go flex it out in the yard, see the control arms, take a look at them, and that way I can kind of show you how the articulation works in the joints. So let's go to the mighty ditch of doom. Dun dun dun. Oh, I'm a yard crawler. All right, let's see what's up. So the Jeep flexed out good. There were no squeaks, no binding. I didn't hear anything weird in the control arms, and it's flexed out pretty good, especially for a Jeep with practically no lift. We're running the 1.5-inch spacers up front, but the control arms, they still have plenty of room for more misalignment. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So in the bracket, we still have a lot more room for that control arm to bend. Same as over here. Uppers are looking pretty good. So So far, I'm pretty impressed. That's flexed out. Right now, it's limited by the shock, but we could still have a ton more down travel before those started to bind. But definitely so far, it seems like they're gonna work out well. Now over here on this side, I'm glad I did this yard test, yard crawling, because the front, it clears fine up in there, but back here, as you can tell right there, we're rubbing on that plastic, so I might trim that up before we actually go off-road and test this with the 37s. Now, I was supposed to go this weekend. Me and Cassie were gonna go wheel this, have some fun, test it out with the 37s, but she had to boogie up to DC for today, so I got pushed back. I think next weekend, we're gonna go wheel this off-road in the rocks and see how it does with 37. But back to what I was talking about. So far, with these control arms, I feel like the suspension is able to articulate and flex a little more without it binding. Right now, there's zero binding. And before, if we did this with the stock control arms, they would be bound up right now, putting stress on the bushings. The body and frame is nice and flat, and the axle's tilted, so those bushings would be really, really struggling right now. With these Johnny joints on the core control arms, they're having no issues handling this. Definitely a great upgrade. So, looks pretty cool. Let's go ahead and pull back up to the driveway before all my neighbors think I'm crazy. All right, guys, this is gonna kind of close out the video. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video or at least learned something. Whether you have a stock Jeep, a lifted Jeep, or you plan on lifting it in the future, I definitely recommend getting a set of adjustable control arms. I would highly suggest checking out Core 4x4. They are a great budget-friendly option. They're not the highest end control arms. You're not gonna get the most flex ever. They're not the complete strongest, but they are a perfect blend of both. Somebody who's looking for a budget-friendly option, something that's really strong and something that's gonna last a long time, that's where Core 4x4 control arms come into play. And they are even offering everybody on this channel 5% off, and they do offer the multiple tier units to suit your needs. You might not be a hardcore rock crawler. You don't need the Johnny joints on both ends. You might be fine with a rubber bushing on one and a Johnny joint on the other. So you can kind of play around with the options, see what fits your budgets and kind of the goal for your Jeep. So thanks for watching. If you have any questions about anything in general, whether it's long arms, short arms, adjustable control arms, you know, Johnny joints, Heim joints, anything, let me know in the comments. I'll be more than happy to answer them. And finally, I'd like to hear on what you're running, whether you're still running the stock, whether you're running Metal Cloak, Rock Crawler, all the other different brands. Let me know in the comments what you like and what you've been running. I know everybody has their own opinion on control arms and types of joints. Let me know in the comments what you run so we can kind of see what's most popular. But on that note, I'm gonna head out. It's starting to get cold. See you guys later. Peace.